My name is Renata, and I was 31 years old when my father looked me in the eye across the kitchen table and said, "We'll manage." Probably. That was his answer when I asked, just once after 3.5 years of never missing a single transfer, if I could skip 1 month while I recovered from surgery. Not a vacation. Not a shopping trip.
Surgery.
And his answer was, "We'll manage." Probably. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I sat with that for about 40 seconds, nodded, and said I understood. What my parents didn't know, what nobody in that family knew, is that I had spent the previous 4 years building something very quiet on the other side of all of it. Every transfer was documented. Every month. Every amount. And I had already had one conversation 9 months earlier with a man named Gerald who worked at the branch downtown and knew exactly what the account history looked like. By the following morning, that account no longer existed. What happened in the weeks after that, at the dining room table in front of my uncle and two of my cousins, is what I want to tell you today. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If you're new here, subscribe and leave a comment. I read every single one. There is a version of family loyalty that looks noble from the outside and feels like slow erosion from the inside. You don't notice it happening because it arrives one reasonable request at a time. One phone call that starts with "we hate to ask" and ends 20 minutes later with a wire transfer amount and a routing number. And then it becomes the rhythm of your life, so consistent and so expected that the day you hesitate, just once, you understand immediately that the loyalty was never mutual. It was structural. You were load-bearing, and nobody thought to ask whether the beam was holding up. I want to tell you exactly how I got there and exactly how I got out. This is going to take a while. I think it's worth it. The shape of my family and the shape of my place in it. I grew up in Clarkfield, a mid-sized city in the middle of the country where everybody more or less knew everybody and where your family's reputation was a thing you carried around with you whether you wanted to or not. My parents, Dora and Frank, were known in our neighborhood as hardworking people who had raised 3 kids and kept the house clean and showed up to things. That part was true. They were present in the physical sense. Holidays happened. Dinners happened. The lawn got mowed. What the neighborhood didn't see was the architecture of the inside. The way that decisions got made. The way that money was talked about or not talked about, and the way that certain unspoken rules calcified over time into something that felt like policy. I am the oldest of 3. My brother Dennis is 3 years younger than me. My sister Carla is 6 years younger. And from the time I was probably 12 or 13 years old, I understood, nobody said it directly, it was just in the air, that my job was to be the stable one. The one who did not create problems. The one who figured things out. Dennis was the one with the ideas, the personality, the thing my mother called his potential, which functioned as a kind of permanent permission slip. Carla was the youngest and had always been managed more carefully, more protectively, in a way I never fully understood until I was older.
My job was to be solid.
Dependable. The one you didn't have to worry about. I took that job seriously. Maybe too seriously. I was a good student, not because anyone pushed me, but because I had internalized the idea that performing well was the same thing as being safe. I graduated high school near the top of my class. I went to a state school on a partial scholarship and worked part-time the entire time to cover the gap. I graduated in accounting, got licensed, got a job at a regional firm in Clarkfield because my parents were here and because it felt like the thing you did when you were the oldest and the solid one, and your parents were starting to get to the age where you didn't know exactly what they might need. That instinct, that pull toward proximity and caretaking, is the thing I have spent a lot of time thinking about since. My first job out of school paid decently for the region. Not lavishly. I was a junior associate at a mid-sized firm, doing tax preparation and payroll audits for small businesses. But I was careful with money, the way people are careful when they grew up watching their parents argue about it. I had a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was fine, but not impressive. I drove a car I had paid cash for. I did not take elaborate vacations. I had a savings account that I put money into every month before I paid anything else. For about 2 years after graduation, things were quiet. I was building something small and careful, and I was proud of it even though I didn't talk about it. Then my dad had a health scare. It wasn't catastrophic, ultimately. A cardiac event, they called it. Not a full heart attack, but serious enough for hospitalization, serious enough for a procedure, serious enough that he was out of work for a couple of months. My dad worked in facilities management for a local company, and while he had insurance, there were gaps. Copays, deductibles, the particular financial erosion that happens when one income disappears for 8 weeks in a household that runs on two. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening. She didn't lead with the money. She led with how scared they had been, how Frank had looked in the hospital bed, how she had sat with him. I listened. I asked questions. I expressed everything a daughter who loves her father should express. And then, toward the end of the call, she said, and I want to quote this accurately because the phrasing matters, she said, "We're just going to be a little tight for a few months while he gets back on his feet. We don't want you to worry." The "we don't want you to worry" framing is interesting in retrospect. It functions as an invitation without being explicitly stated as one. I said, "Mom, let me help. Just while he's recovering. I can send something every month."
She paused.
Then, "We would never want to put that on you. You're not putting it on me. I want to." The number we landed on was $1,200 a month. That was the first number. That was the reasonable number. The temporary number for while Dad got back on his feet. He got back on his feet. The $1,200 did not stop. I want to be careful here not to make it sound like a sudden shift, because it wasn't. It was gradual. The way water changes things gradually. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. The amount changed once, 18 months in, when my mother mentioned that property taxes were coming due, and they were a little short. Could I do $1,500 for a few months? Just to get through.
I said yes.
At no point did anyone say the words permanent or ongoing. At no point did anyone present this as a formal arrangement. It just kept continuing, and I kept participating in the continuation, and somewhere in there the mental category that had held it, temporary help while Dad recovers, quietly dissolved, and the money just became a feature of the landscape. By the time I turned 28, I was sending $2,000 a month. By the time I turned 29, it was $2,800. By my 30th birthday, the month I transferred into a senior associate role at the firm and got a meaningful raise, my mother called to tell me that the roof needed work and that Dennis's car had broken down and he needed something reliable to get to his job. Could I do $3,500? Just for the year, while things settled down. She said, "You're doing so well, Renata. We're so proud. We just know you can handle it." I said yes. I want to be honest. I said yes because I could afford it, and because I believed it was temporary, and because I had built my whole identity around being the one who handled things. But I also want to be honest about something else. I said yes because I didn't know yet what the $1,200 a month I had started with had actually turned into over time. I didn't have a single document that laid it all out. The transfers were automatic. The acknowledgment on their end was minimal, a text sometimes, a thank you that folded itself into an ordinary phone call. I had never sat down and done the arithmetic on the total. I had never needed to. That was going to change. The account, the uncle, and the thing I built quietly. My father's older brother is named Gerald. Not the Gerald at the bank. A different Gerald. Uncle Gerald is my father's older brother by 4 years, a retired civil engineer who has lived alone since his wife passed 8 years ago, and who has the particular quality of stillness that some older men develop when they have spent a long time paying attention. He calls me on my birthday every year. He has never once asked me for money. Gerald came to Clarkfield twice a year, once in the spring and once around the holidays. He would stay at my parents' house, which I found interesting even as an adult, because Gerald and my father have always had a complicated relationship. Not hostile, not warm either. The kind of relationship that exists between two people who share a history and have quietly negotiated not to examine it too closely. What I did not know, until about 9 months before everything happened, is that Gerald had been paying attention to me specifically for a while. Not in an intrusive way. Just watching. Asking questions during our birthday calls that I thought were casual, but that I later understood were something more deliberate. He called me in January of the year everything changed. It was a longer call than usual. He asked about work, about the apartment, about whether I was seeing anyone. Standard Gerald. And then, toward the end, he asked, casually but not casually, "How are things going with your parents?" Financially, I mean. Are they asking much of you? I was careful. I said things were fine, we had a little arrangement, nothing that was a burden. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Renata, I want to tell you something. And I want you to think about it, not react to it. Would that be all right? I said it would. What Gerald told me, in that call, is that he had been watching the pattern for a long time. That he had his own history with my father and money that he did not need to detail. That he had watched my grandmother navigate a version of the same thing before she passed. He said, the people in our family who carry the weight almost never know what the total is. Because nobody adds it up for them. I think you might want to add it up. I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I opened a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet took me about 3 hours to complete. I went back through 4 years of bank statements. I have always been meticulous about records, occupational habit, and I logged every single transfer.
Date.
Amount. Running total. The running total, when I finished, was $168,000. I sat with that number for a while. I want to describe what it felt like without naming the feeling directly, because the feeling was not simple. My hands went cold. There was something that happened behind my sternum, not pain exactly, more like a recognition, the way you feel when a shape you've been looking at from too close suddenly comes into focus, and you understand what it actually is. $168,000. Over 4 years. In transfers I had made voluntarily, without ever once receiving a signed acknowledgment, a note of thanks, or a single piece of documentation about where the money had gone. I did not call my parents that night. I did not call Dennis or Carla. I called Gerald. He listened. When I finished reading him the total, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't know yet, but I wanted to make sure the record was complete before I decided anything. He said, "That's the right instinct." Over the next several months, I did 3 things quietly. I printed and organized the full transfer history into a bound document, dates, amounts, cumulative totals, the works. I met with Gerald twice, once in person when he came through in the spring. And I went to see the Gerald at the bank, my branch manager who had handled my accounts for 6 years, and I told him I was thinking about closing the account my parents' transfers came from and wanted to understand what that process looked like. He told me it was straightforward. Same day, if I wanted. I said I'd let him know when I was ready. The day I asked for 1 month. The surgery I needed was not dramatic. An abdominal hernia that had been monitored for 2 years and had reached the point where my doctor said it was time to deal with it. Outpatient procedure, 2 to 3 weeks of restricted activity, full recovery within a month. I had the sick time. I had the savings. I had planned it for a Monday in March, so I could use the weekend on either side. What I needed, practically, logistically, was 1 month where I was not sending $3,500 while I was also paying for the procedure, the follow-up appointments, the 2 weeks where I could not work full hours. Not a permanent stop. 1 month. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in February. I brought coffee. I sat down at their kitchen table. I explained the surgery, not in alarming terms, just the facts. I said I wanted to let them know in advance, and that I was thinking I would need to skip the transfer in March. My mother's face did something subtle. The kind of adjustment that you would miss if you weren't looking for it. She said, "Of course, your health comes first. We've gotten used to structuring things around that." She looked at my father. My father looked at me. He said, "We'll manage." Probably. Not, of course. Not, don't even think about it. Not, Renata, after everything. We'll manage. Probably. There was a pause. The kind of pause where a room becomes very specific. I could hear the refrigerator running. I looked at the table. I said, "Okay." I drove home. I sat in my parking lot for about 10 minutes before I went inside. Something had settled in me on that drive. Not anger, not the kind of cold, sharp thing that produces regret later. Something quieter and more final. The word that kept occurring to me was, enough. I called Gerald that evening. I told him what had happened. He said, "I think you know what you want to do." I said, "I think I do." The next morning, I went to the bank before work. I sat across from Gerald. The bank Gerald, and I told him I was ready. He pulled up the account. We went through the process. 40 minutes later, The account my parents had received 4 years of transfers from was closed. Funds redistributed to my primary savings. The account history printed in full, 12 pages, was in my bag. I went to work. I did payroll audits for a manufacturer on the east side. I ate lunch at my desk. I drove home. I did not call my parents that day. I did not call them the next day, or the one after that. What I did was call my Uncle Gerald and tell him it was done. He said, "Good." Then he said, "I'd like to come to Clarkfield for a visit. In a few weeks, if that's all right. I've been thinking about having dinner with the family." I said that sounded fine. The dinner. My mother hosts a Sunday dinner approximately once a month. This is a long-standing tradition and one of the ways the family maintains the appearance of cohesion. The guest list varies. Sometimes it is just the immediate family, sometimes cousins are included, sometimes a neighbor or two. In late March, 3 weeks after my surgery and 2.5 weeks after I had closed the account, Gerald came to Clarkfield and my mother, not knowing anything that I knew, invited him to Sunday dinner as she always did when he was in town. Also at the table, Dennis and his girlfriend at the time. My cousin Patricia, who is Gerald's goddaughter and who had driven in from 2 hours away. And Carla, who was living nearby, and almost always came. I came. I brought a dish. I sat where I always sit. My mother had made the kind of meal she makes when she wants the table to look a certain way, multiple courses, the good dishes, the effort visible. She was in a particular mood I recognized, warm but slightly pressurized, the way she gets when something is not resolved and she is managing around it through performance. She had not said anything, in our limited contact over those 3 weeks, about the missed transfer. She had not asked how the surgery went. Dennis had texted me 4 days after the procedure, "Hope you're doing okay," and that was the sum total of family acknowledgment. Patricia and Gerald were the ones who had called. That I noted. Dinner proceeded normally for the first hour. Gerald was warm, conversational, asking Patricia about her work, asking Carla about her apartment, telling a story about a bridge project he had consulted on in the 90s that had required 3 separate engineering redesigns. My father was quieter than usual. My mother kept the food moving. It was around the time the plates were being cleared that my mother said, and she said it in the particular tone of voice that signals something is being raised in a group setting because it cannot be raised privately. She said, "I do want to say, since we're all here, that March was a little difficult for us financially. We had some gaps we weren't expecting." She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at the table. Gerald set down his water glass. He said, "What kind of gaps, Dora?" My mother hesitated. "Just the usual. Fixed costs. You know how it is." My father said, "Things we've been counting on didn't come through the way we expected." Gerald said, "I see." And then, in a completely conversational tone, he said, "Renata, do you have the document with you? The one we discussed?" Every person at that table processed that question differently. Patricia's head came up. Carla's fork paused. Dennis looked at me, then at Gerald, then back at me. My mother's expression did the thing where it attempts to remain neutral and does not quite succeed. My father went very still. I said, "Yes." I reached into my bag. I had carried it on Gerald's advice, folded flat, inside a manila envelope, and I placed the printed account history on the table. Gerald did not pick it up. He said, "Would you walk us through what that is?" I said, "It's a printed record of every transfer I made to my parents' account between January of 4 years ago and February of this year. The date, the amount, and the running total for each one." Dennis said, What is this?" Gerald said, in the same quiet voice, "The total, Renata, if you don't mind." I said, $168,000. The table was quiet. Patricia looked at my mother. My mother looked at the document. My father looked at nothing in particular, at a space somewhere above the centerpiece. Something left his face in that moment. Not guilt exactly. More like the structural support behind an expression giving way. Gerald said, "I want to make sure everyone understands what they're looking at. Renata has been making monthly transfers to your account." He looked at my parents. "Every month for 4 years. Including months she didn't have to. Including a month when she had surgery. She asked in February to skip 1 month. And Frank, you told her you'd manage. Probably. My father's jaw moved. No sound came out. My mother said, Gerald, this is a family matter. He said, I know it is. That's why I'm here. Carla had not spoken since Gerald said my name. She was looking at me now, and I could see her doing the kind of arithmetic you do when a number that large lands in front of you, and you start putting your own history alongside it. She said, quietly, Renata. I didn't know. I said, I know. Dennis said, none of us knew this was, I didn't know it was that much. His girlfriend was looking at the tablecloth. My mother said, we were grateful. We have always been grateful. We just didn't. Gerald said, gently but with a finality that closed the sentence off, Dora. She asked for 1 month. The room went still the way rooms go still when something has been named that cannot be unnamed. Not loud, not dramatic, just permanently different from the moment before. Gerald picked up the document. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back down in front of me. He said, the account is closed. I think that's the right decision. And I think there are some conversations this family needs to have that don't involve Renata funding them. My father looked at his hands. My mother's face had gone past the managed warmth expression into something that had no performance in it at all. She looked tired. She looked, in that moment, like someone who has been holding a thing for a long time and has just been asked to put it down. What came after? The drive home that evening was quiet. Not the bad kind of quiet. The kind where things have been resolved in a way that doesn't require noise. My phone started producing messages about 40 minutes after I left. Dennis first. Can we talk tomorrow? Just us? Then Patricia. You okay? That took guts. Then Carla, a longer message, which I did not read in the car. My mother did not message that night. My father called 4 days later. It was a short call. He said he had been thinking about what happened at dinner. He said he wanted to say he was sorry. Not a long speech. Just those words, plainly. I said I heard him. I said I appreciated it. I said I hoped he was feeling well. We talked for about 6 minutes, and then we got off the phone. My mother took longer. About 2 weeks. When she called, she said things that were not quite apologies but were adjacent to them. She talked about how the financial pressure had felt, about how they had come to depend on the structure of the transfers without fully acknowledging what they were asking of me, about how she had told herself I was fine because I had never said I wasn't. I said, I know. And I meant it without malice. I believe she had told herself that. I believe she had needed to. She asked at the end of that call what I needed from them going forward. I told her I needed the arrangement to be over. She said it was. Dennis came for coffee 2 Sundays later, and we talked for 3 hours. He was honest in a way he had not always been. He said he had known in a general way that I was sending money and that he had let himself not ask about it because it was easier. He said he was ashamed of that. I respected the honesty. Carla sent me a letter. An actual letter, handwritten, which I still have. She said things in it that I will not repeat here because they were meant for me and not for anyone else, but I want you to know she said them. The quieter things. What I want to tell you about the period after all of this is that it was remarkably ordinary. I had expected some sustained discomfort, the social fallout, the walking on eggshells quality of family events, the possibility of extended estrangement.
Some of that happened.
The first holiday gathering after the dinner was different. There was more care in how people moved around each other. My parents were quieter than usual. The performance of ease that usually runs through those gatherings was slightly less glossy. But it recalibrated. Not immediately, not without friction, but it did. What surprised me most was what the absence of the transfer felt like. I had been so accustomed to the monthly outflow that I had stopped noticing it as a thing I was doing. When it was gone, I felt it, not as loss, but as space. The particular kind of space that arrives when a recurring weight is simply not there anymore. I booked a trip that summer. Nothing extravagant. A week on the coast with a friend from the firm. I had a specific memory, somewhere in that trip, of sitting in a rented kitchen making breakfast and understanding that this trip had been funded by a single month of money that 4 years ago would have gone elsewhere. That understanding was very quiet and very complete. Gerald came to Clarkfield that fall, as he always does. He stayed with my parents, as he always does. He and I had dinner alone one evening at a restaurant downtown that I'd been meaning to try. He ordered carefully the way he does everything, and we talked about his garden and my promotion, and a book we had both read. At the end of the evening, he said, "You handled that well." I said, "You helped." He said, "I asked a question. You had built everything already." I drove him back to my parents' house. When he got out of the car, he paused and looked back at me through the window. He said, 4 words. I knew what he meant. He meant the 4 words my father had said in the kitchen. He said, "That's what told you everything you needed to know." I said, "Yes." He nodded. Then he went inside. The thing I carry out of it. There is a version of obligation that is constructed to feel like love. It wears the same clothes. It uses similar language. It arrives at the same kitchen table, and it pours coffee the same way. The difference is what it does when you need something back. Obligation that looks like love answers will manage. Probably. It offers you the bare minimum of conditional support and then resumes the expectation of unconditional delivery. The thing I know now that I didn't know at 27 is that the total matters. Not because money is the point, money is rarely the point, but because the total makes visible what cannot be argued with. $168,000 across 4 years is not a conversation. It is a document. And documents, unlike feelings, don't require the other person to agree. I am 33 now. I have a savings account that I think about very differently than I did 4 years ago. I have a family that is imperfect and present and in most of the ways that count, honestly trying. I have an uncle who asks good questions and knows when to sit at a table. And I have a printed account history in a manila envelope in the top drawer of my filing cabinet. I've thought about whether to get rid of it. I've decided to keep it, not as evidence, not as a grievance, just as a reminder of what it felt like to finally know the number. That's my story. A bank statement, a manila envelope, and a Sunday dinner. Here's what I want to ask you. If you had spent years quietly carrying a financial weight for your family, and the moment you needed something back you got, "Will manage, probably," what would you have done? Would you have waited longer? Or would you have known, in that kitchen, that you'd already waited long enough? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.